Ottawa, Illinois, June 4, 1922. She was 17 years old when her jawbone fell out. Catherine Donohue didn't feel it happen. She was simply walking down the hallway of the Radium Dial Company, her paintbrush still wet between her fingers, when she felt something shift in her mouth. Not pain, not yet, but a hollow looseness, as if a tooth had come unmarred. She touched her cheek. Her fingers came away covered in blood and bone. Catherine opened her mouth and let the pieces fall into her hand. White fragments, glistening, no larger than pebbles. She stared at them, uncomprehending, then looked up to see her supervisor, Mr. Reed, watching from his office doorway. His face was gray. He turned away quickly and closed the door. Later, the doctor would tell her it was syphilis. Later still, another doctor would suggest phosphorus poisoning, then iron deficiency, then hysteria. But in that hallway, standing in her cotton dress with the radium paint still glowing faintly on her fingernails, Catherine Donohue knew the truth before science could confirm it. The pretty dust that made her feel like an angel, that had made her the envy of every girl in Ottawa, Illinois, was eating her alive from the inside. She was not the first. She would not be the last. And she would become one of the most dangerous women in America, because she refused to die quietly. This is the story of the Radium Girls. It is the story of a corporate conspiracy that spanned 2 decades. It is the story of the birth of modern occupational safety law. It is the story of young women, some as young as 14, who were told they were handling harmless, miracle paint, who were instructed to put radioactive brushes in their mouths 300 times a day to keep the tips sharp, who danced in the dark for joy at their own luminescence while their bones turned to honeycomb and their bodies became lanterns that glowed through their skin even after death. By the time you finish reading, you will know their names. You will know their faces. And you will understand how a handful of dying factory workers in Illinois and New Jersey forced the most powerful industrial interests in America to bend the knee, and in doing so, saved millions of lives you will never know to thank them for. But we begin in the dark, with a miracle. It is the story of a corporate conspiracy that spanned 2 decades. It is the story of the birth of modern occupational safety law. It is the story of young women, some as young as 14, who were told they were handling harmless, miracle paint, who were instructed to put radioactive brushes in their mouths 300 times a day to keep the tips sharp, who danced in the dark for joy at their own luminescence while their bones turned to honeycomb and their bodies became lanterns that glowed through their skin even after death. By the time you finish reading, you will know their names. You will know their faces. And you will understand how a handful of dying factory workers in Illinois and New Jersey forced the most powerful industrial interests in America to bend the knee, and in doing so, saved millions of lives you will never know to thank them for. But we begin in the dark, with a miracle. Newark, New Jersey, 1917. The United States Radium Corporation did not look like a house of horrors. It looked like opportunity. Set on the industrial edge of Newark, New Jersey, the plant was a modest brick building that hummed with the energy of wartime production. The year was 1917, and America had finally entered the Great War raging across Europe. Soldiers were drowning in trenches, choking on gas, stumbling through no man's land in darkness. The U.S. military needed watches, thousands of them, that could be read at night without giving away a soldier's position to German snipers. Enter radium. The miracle element. Discovered by Marie Curie in 1898, radium had captured the world's imagination. It was liquid sunshine, a substance that glowed without fire, that seemed to defy the fundamental entropy of the universe. Dr. Frederick Flynn, a Harvard-educated toxicologist who would later become crucial to this story, toured the country lecturing that radium could cure everything from arthritis to failing manhood. The Radium Institute in New York offered radium injections for $150 a treatment, roughly $3,000 today. Radium water, radium toothpaste, radium bread, radium suppositories. The world had gone radium mad, and nowhere was the madness more profitable than in the dial painting studios of Orange, New Jersey. The job paid well, 3 cents per dial, which worked out to roughly $20 a week when most factory girls made $12. The work required a steady hand and good eyesight. The ideal candidate was young, unmarried, and poor, precisely the demographic that could be found in abundance in the immigrant neighborhoods of Newark and the small farming towns of Illinois. Grace Fryer was 18 when she applied at U.S. Radium in 1917. She was a striking girl with dark hair and serious eyes, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had fled the famine years. She'd graduated from Orange High School, a rare achievement for a working-class girl, and had been working as a bank teller when her mother fell ill. The bank paid $8 a week. Radium Dial offered nearly triple that. The interview was brief. The supervisor, a man named Savoy, explained the process. The girls would sit at long tables, each with a palette of paint containing radium powder mixed with glue and water. Using fine-tipped camel hair brushes, they would paint tiny numbers onto watch dials, working in the plant's dimly lit interior because bright light would ruin the glow-in-the-dark property of the paint. The brushes lose their shape quickly, Savoy explained. You'll need to point them between your lips. Like this. He demonstrated, putting the brush tip in his mouth, wetting it to a fine point, then returning to the dial. Lip, dip, paint. Lip, dip, paint. 300 times a day, maybe more. Keeps the lines crisp. Grace hesitated. Is it safe? The paint, I mean? Savoy smiled. It was a practice smile, one he gave dozens of times a week. Safer than the air you breathe, miss. It's medicinal, actually. Dr. Flynn himself takes radium treatments. Look here. He pulled out a newspaper clipping showing a glowing radium spa in France. People pay good money to bathe in this stuff. You're getting paid to do what millionaires pay for. Consider it a perk. Grace took the job. She was not alone. By 1918, U.S. Radium employed over 300 dial painters, almost all of them women between 14 and 25. They worked in a large, open room on the second floor, sitting on wooden stools at long tables, their heads bent over the tiny dials. The paint came in 4 colors, standard white for the numbers, and special mixtures for military instruments. The most prized assignment was painting the undark compound, the military-grade radium paint that glowed brightest and longest. The girls quickly discovered that the paint made them glow. Not metaphorically, literally. If they didn't wash thoroughly, their skin would luminesce in the dark. They wore their best dresses to work, knowing they'd come home speckled with stardust. At lunch, they painted their faces and nails, laughing as they admired their reflections in darkened bathrooms. Some, like Molly Maggia, a 17-year-old from a large Italian family, would paint her teeth and smile at her boyfriend in the dark, her mouth a ghastly green grin. They were called the Ghost Girls. They didn't mind. In an era before women could vote, before the flapper had fully emerged, before the very concept of teenage culture existed, these working-class girls had something precious. They were special. They earned more than their fathers. They had spending money for silk stockings and movie tickets. And they glowed. What they didn't know, what U.S. Radium's executives knew with absolute certainty, was that they were being poisoned. The science was not ambiguous, not even in 1917. A German scientist named Karl von Hess had published a paper in 1911 detailing the biological effects of radium exposure. The Curies themselves had suffered radiation burns. At the U.S. Radium plant, the executives and scientists worked behind lead shields. The chemists used masks and tongs. When the radium powder was mixed, it was done in a separate, ventilated room that the dial painters never entered. The Palm Beach Police Department, led by Chief Michael Ryder and Detective Joseph Ricari, began what they believed would be a straightforward investigation. They quickly discovered it was anything but. Underage girls, many of them 15 and 16 years old, began coming forward with eerily similar accounts. They were recruited by friends or by Epstein's assistants, brought to the mansion for massages, and then subjected to sexual abuse. Some were paid to recruit others, creating a pyramid scheme of exploitation that ensnared vulnerable children from broken homes, from foster care, from the margins of a wealthy community where desperation and privilege collided. By May 2006, Ryder and Carey believed they had enough evidence to charge Epstein with multiple counts of unlawful sex with a minor, serious felonies that could have put him away for decades. But then something unprecedented happened. State Attorney Barry Krischer, the chief prosecutor for Palm Beach County, took the unusual and controversial step of refusing to authorize the charges. Instead, he sent the case to a grand jury, a body that would ultimately indict Epstein on only a single count of soliciting prostitution, a misdemeanor that treated the child victims as commercial sex workers rather than exploited minors. Catherine Donohue was 15 when she started. Like Grace Fryer before her, she was intelligent, ambitious, and poor. Her father was a day laborer. Her mother took in washing. Catherine had graduated 8th grade, more education than most girls in her neighborhood received, and she dreamed of becoming a nurse, maybe even a doctor. The radium dial job was supposed to be temporary, a way to save for nursing school. She was beautiful in the way of Midwestern farm girls, clear skin, strong bones, a wide smile. Her supervisor, a man named Leo Kelly, noticed her immediately. He was 35, married, with a reputation for mentoring the younger employees. He took Catherine under his wing, praising her steady hand, her quick pace. She could paint 300 dials a day, sometimes more. At 3 cents a dial, she was making $20 a week, more than her father. The work was social, almost festive. The girls chatted as they painted, sharing gossip and dreams. Catherine became close with Charlotte Purcell, a sharp-tongued girl from a troubled home, and Inez Vallat, whose French-Canadian parents had migrated from Quebec. They were the Three Musketeers, inseparable. They also engaged in the same practices as their New Jersey predecessors. They painted their nails, their faces, their teeth. They wore their good dresses to work, coming home luminous. Catherine particularly loved the feeling of the brush between her lips, the slight metallic tang, the way it focused her mind. Lip, dip, paint. The rhythm became meditative. She felt like an artist, a creator of light. The first sign came 8 months later. Catherine noticed her teeth felt loose. Not painful, exactly, but mobile, as if they were floating in her gums rather than anchored. She mentioned it to her mother, who suggested she was grinding her teeth in her sleep. Then came the aches, not in her teeth, but deep in her hips, her knees, her jaw. A dull, persistent throb that no amount of aspirin could touch. She went to Dr. Flynn. Yes, the same Dr. Frederick Flynn who had toured the country promoting radium as a cure-all. He had, by this point, become U.S. Radium's paid medical consultant. His examination of Catherine was brief. "You're anemic," he declared. "Common in young women. Eat more red meat, get more rest. Nothing to worry about." But Catherine continued to worry. Her teeth kept loosening. One morning, she spat out a molar while brushing. It came away cleanly, root and all, the socket oozing blood that wouldn't clot. Then, in June of 1922, the jawbone came loose. She was not alone. Across the plant, girls were suffering. Charlotte Purcell's hair was falling out in clumps. Inez Vallat had developed strange sores on her legs that wouldn't heal. Pearl Payne, a 16-year-old, had such severe anemia that she fainted at her workstation. The company doctor, a man named Dallach, prescribed iron tablets and sent them back to work. The executives knew. Of course they knew. Back in New Jersey, the death toll was mounting. In 1922 alone, 4 U.S. radium dial painters had died. Amelia Maggia, Molly's sister, had gone first, her jaw disintegrating until a dentist could pull it away from her skull with his fingers. Her death certificate read, "Syphilis." Irene Rudolph died next, her spine collapsing like a stack of cards. Her death certificate read, "Phosphorus poisoning." Marguerite Carlo and Hazel Vincent followed, both in their early 20s, both with identical symptoms: rotting bones, failed blood, organs turned to pulp. The company had a strategy. It was elegant in its cruelty. First, deny that radium was dangerous. Second, attribute all illnesses to other causes. Syphilis was preferred because it carried moral stigma, effectively silencing the victims and their families. Third, if denial became impossible, delay. Delay until the statute of limitations expired. Delay until the victims died. The statute of limitations was the key. In both New Jersey and Illinois, worker compensation laws required claims to be filed within 2 years of the injury. But radium poisoning was insidious. It didn't announce itself with a fall or a visible wound. It hid in the bones, simmering for months, sometimes years. By the time symptoms appeared, by the time doctors identified the cause, if they ever did, the 2-year window had often closed. This was not accidental. It was design. New York City, 1924. Arthur Roeder was not a monster. This is important to understand. He was, by all accounts, a devoted husband, a loving father, a church-going man who donated to charity and believed in the progress of American industry. He was also the president of U.S. Radium Corporation, and he was about to preside over one of the most cold-blooded corporate cover-ups in American history. The crisis began with a letter. In 1924, a former U.S. radium chemist named Dr. Edwin Lehman wrote to the company's board with troubling news. Lehman himself was dying. His bones were disintegrating, his blood counts catastrophic, but he had retained his conscience. He warned that the dial painters were being poisoned, that the lip-pointing method was lethal, that the company had a moral and legal obligation to act. Roeder called an emergency board meeting. The minutes of that meeting, later uncovered by investigators, reveal a fascinating psychological portrait of corporate decision-making under pressure. Dr. von Sauchuki, the company's founder, argued for immediate action. "We must warn the girls," he insisted. "We must change the process. The liability is precisely why we cannot warn them," interrupted Clarence Lee, the company's lawyer. "If we acknowledge that we knew of the danger, we admit negligence. We open ourselves to unlimited damages. As it stands, we can claim ignorance. We followed standard practices. We relied on Dr. Flynn's assessments." Dr. Flynn, present at the meeting, nodded vigorously. He had, by this point, reversed his public position on radium's safety, but only in private consultations with the company. Publicly, he continued to maintain that the element was harmless in small quantities. "We have another problem," Lee continued. "The New Jersey Department of Labor has begun asking questions. Commissioner Drinker is making noises about inspections. We need to control the narrative." The narrative. It was always about the narrative. Roeder made his decision. They would implement superficial changes. The lip-pointing would officially be discouraged, though production quotas would remain the same, effectively forcing the practice to continue. They would offer free medical examinations by company doctors, who would diagnose anything but radium poisoning. And they would begin a campaign of disinformation, flooding medical journals with articles questioning the connection between radium and illness. Most importantly, they would watch the calendar. 2 years. That was the magic number. If they could keep the sick girls from filing claims for 2 years from their date of hire, or, better yet, if they could keep them from realizing they were sick until after that window closed, the company would be legally invulnerable. It worked for a while. In New Jersey, the deaths continued, but the cause remained officially mysterious. The girls were buried with shame, syphilis, tuberculosis, wasting disease, their families too grieving and too poor to question the diagnoses. The dial painters who remained healthy enough to work kept painting, kept lip-pointing, kept glowing in the dark. But in Illinois, the timeline was different. The plant was newer. The poison had not yet worked its way as deeply into the bones. And Catherine Donohue, against all odds, was about to become a very inconvenient woman. By 1925, Catherine Donohue was 20 years old and dying. Her jaw was gone, surgically removed after it had rotted away, leaving her unable to eat solid food. She weighed less than 90 pounds. Her hips were so damaged that she could barely walk, her femurs honeycombed with radium-induced osteonecrosis. She had given birth to a son, Tommy, in 1924, a pregnancy that had accelerated her decline, as the radium in her bones leached into her breast milk and her blood. But Catherine Donohue had something the New Jersey girls lacked: time. And she had Charlotte Purcell. Charlotte was the fighter, the scrapper, the girl with a tongue like a razor and a sense of justice that bordered on religious fervor. When Catherine's jaw came out, Charlotte had gone to the newspapers. When the newspapers ignored her, U.S. Radium was a major advertiser, and libel laws were generous. She went to lawyers. She found Leonard Grossman. Grossman was 32, a Jewish lawyer from Chicago who had made his name defending union organizers. He was not, by temperament, a radical. He believed in the law, in its capacity to deliver justice. When Charlotte and Catherine limped into his office in the summer of 1925, he was initially skeptical. 3 young women, Catherine, Charlotte, and Inez Vallat, who was also showing early symptoms, claiming they were poisoned by watch paint. It sounded like hysteria, like the kind of female complaint that male doctors had been dismissing for centuries. Then he examined Catherine's medical records. He consulted independent doctors. He read the German studies on radium toxicity, the internal U.S. radium memos that had leaked to the press in New Jersey. And he became convinced that he was looking at not just a tragedy, but a crime. The statute of limitations, he told the women, is our enemy. In Illinois, you have 2 years from the date of injury to file a claim. When were you first exposed? Then we have months, not years. And the company will argue that your injury occurred in 1922, when you first swallowed the paint. They'll say you're too late. But we didn't know, Charlotte protested. We didn't know we were injured until her jaw. That may be our argument. The discovery rule, that the statute doesn't begin until you knew, or should have known, of the injury. But it's untested in Illinois. And the company will fight. Then we'll fight back, Catherine said. It was the most she'd spoken in weeks. The effort left her trembling, but her eyes, those dark, Irish eyes, were clear. They told us it was safe. They watched us die. And now they'll say we're too late? No. I won't die for nothing. My son won't grow up thinking his mother was a whore who died of syphilis. We fight. Grossman filed suit in September 1925, Donohue versus Radium Dial Corporation. He filed on behalf of 5 women, Catherine, Charlotte, Inez, and 2 others who had come forward. They asked for $50,000 each, roughly $850,000 today. Not for the money, Catherine insisted, but for the principle. For the record. For Tommy. Radium Dial's response was immediate and vicious. They hired Francis McNulty, one of Chicago's most feared corporate lawyers. They countersued for libel, claiming the women were fabricating their illnesses to extort money. They subpoenaed Catherine's medical records, her sexual history, her family background. They hired private detectives to follow the women, to interview their neighbors, to dig for dirt. And they played for time. The first motion McNulty filed was to dismiss on statute of limitations grounds. The case, he argued, was barred by law. The women had been exposed in 1922. They had filed in 1925. The 2-year window had closed. Grossman's counterargument was novel. He cited a principle from contract law, the discovery rule, and argued it should apply to occupational diseases. The injury was not the exposure, but the manifestation. The clock should start not when the radium entered their bodies, but when they knew it was killing them. The judge, a conservative named Jesse Hold'em, was skeptical. But he was also, crucially, unwilling to dismiss outright. He set a hearing for December 1925. The women would have to testify. Catherine prepared to die on the witness stand. Chicago, Illinois, December 1925. The courtroom of the Cook County Superior Court was packed on the morning of December 21, 1925. The case had attracted attention, morbid, sensational attention. "Glow girls sue for death paint," screamed the Chicago Tribune. "Radium victims seek $250,000. The public had come to see the freak show, young women who glowed in the dark, who were rotting alive, who claimed that something as innocent as watch paint could kill. Catherine Donohue was carried into the courtroom on a stretcher. She weighed 70 pounds. She had no jaw, no teeth, a tracheostomy tube in her throat to help her breathe. Her left leg was in a cast. Her femur had fractured spontaneously the week before, simply by bearing her weight. She was dressed in her best, a blue wool dress that hung loosely on her frame, a hat with a veil to hide the hollows of her face. The defense's strategy became clear in the first hour. McNulty did not dispute that Catherine was dying. He disputed why. "Mrs. Donohue," he said, approaching the witness stand with a smile that contained no warmth. "You admit you were a factory worker. You admit you painted watch dials. But you also admit you were a young woman of active social habits, shall we say?" "I don't know what you mean," Catherine whispered. "I mean that before your marriage, you were seen in the company of various young men. That you frequented dance halls. That your morals were, let us say, flexible." Objections from Grossman. Sustained, but the damage was done. The jury, 12 men, all white, all middle class or above, had heard it. The whore diagnosis. Syphilis. It was easier to believe that a poor Irish girl had contracted venereal disease than that a respectable corporation had poisoned her. McNulty produced Dr. Flynn, who testified that he had examined Catherine and found evidence of long-standing syphilitic infection. He produced Dr. Dallach, the company doctor, who claimed he had warned the girls against lip-pointing and that they had ignored him. He produced time cards showing Catherine had worked irregular hours, implying she had been fired for cause, not illness. But Grossman had prepared. He called Dr. Alice Hamilton. Dr. Hamilton was 56, a pioneer of industrial medicine, the first female professor at Harvard Medical School. She had spent her career documenting occupational diseases, lead poisoning in battery factories, mercury madness in hat shops. She had examined the New Jersey deaths. She was unimpeachable. "The symptoms described," she testified, "are classic radium poisoning. The destruction of the jawbone, radium jaw, it's called in the medical literature. The spontaneous fractures. The anemia. These women are not syphilitic, Mr. McNulty. They are being eaten alive by radioactive decay." McNulty tried to dismiss her as a hysterical female, a crusader with an agenda. But Hamilton's credentials were too solid, her manner too calm and scientific. She explained the physics, how radium, chemically similar to calcium, was deposited in the bones. How it emitted alpha, beta, and gamma radiation, blasting the surrounding tissue with high-energy particles. How it had a half-life of 1,600 years, meaning it would remain active long after the women were dust. "The body cannot eliminate it," she concluded. "Once ingested, it is permanent. And it is invariably fatal." The turning point came with Charlotte Purcell's testimony. Charlotte was not as far gone as Catherine. She could still walk, still speak clearly. She described the work, the lip-pointing, the encouragement from supervisors, the complete absence of warnings. "Did anyone ever tell you the paint was dangerous?" Grossman asked. "No, sir." "Did you ever see safety equipment? Masks? Gloves?" "No, sir. We were told it was harmless. We were told it would make us healthy. Why did you lip point? Why put the brush in your mouth?" Charlotte looked directly at the jury. "Because we were told to. Because if we didn't, we couldn't meet our quotas. Because we trusted them." McNulty's cross-examination was brutal. He accused her of lying about her symptoms, of conspiring with Grossman to extort money, of being a radical, influenced by communist labor organizers. Charlotte withstood it. When he suggested she was exaggerating her pain, she rolled up her sleeves and showed the jury her arms, covered in lesions, the skin peeling away, bones visible beneath. "I am 22 years old," she said. "I wanted to be a mother. I wanted to grow old. And I will die because I painted watches. Is that exaggeration, Mr. McNulty?" The jury deliberated for 3 days. On Christmas Eve, 1925, they returned a verdict for the plaintiffs. The statute of limitations, they found, had not begun until the women knew they were injured. The company was ordered to pay $10,000 to each woman, far less than the $50,000 requested, but a staggering admission of liability. Radium Dial appealed. Of course they appealed. They would drag the case through the courts for years, until Catherine was dead, until Charlotte was too sick to continue, until the public had moved on to other scandals. But something had shifted. The Radium Girls, as the press had dubbed them, had become a cause. Labor unions took up their banner. Women's groups organized fundraisers. Marie Curie herself, contacted by a reporter, expressed horror at the criminal negligence and offered to testify, though her declining health prevented it. And in Washington, a young congresswoman named Alice Robertson inserted a notice into the congressional record. "These women," she wrote, "have suffered a wrong that cries to heaven. We must ensure that no American worker is ever again sacrificed to industrial greed." It would take another decade, and many more deaths, before that cry was answered. East Orange, New Jersey, 1927. Grace Fryer had not given up. While the Illinois case dragged through appeals, she had been fighting her own battle in New Jersey. In 1927, she and 4 other surviving U.S. radium workers, Quinta McDonald, Albina Larice, Edna Hussman, and Catherine Schaub, filed suit against their former employer. They were represented by Raymond Berry, a young attorney who had been inspired by the Illinois case. New Jersey was different. The statute of limitations was equally brutal, but the body count was higher, the evidence clearer. Berry devised a new strategy. He would not sue for personal injury, but for fraud. U.S. Radium had known the dangers and concealed them. That fraud, he argued, had prevented the women from discovering their injuries in time to file. The clock should start not from exposure, but from discovery of the fraud. It was a legal Hail Mary, but it worked. In 1928, after months of hearings, the New Jersey Supreme Court allowed the case to proceed. The trial began in January 1928. This time, the company was ready. They had learned from Illinois. They flooded the courtroom with doctors, with expert witnesses, with character assassins. They argued that the women were suffering from a combination of poor hygiene, venereal disease, and hysterical neurosis, a condition they claimed was common in working-class females. They produced studies, paid for by U.S. Radium, showing that radium was beneficial in small doses. But the science was catching up. Dr. Harrison Martland, the medical examiner of Essex County, New Jersey, had been conducting his own research. He had developed a technique to measure radium in living bodies, by analyzing their breath. Radium decay produced radon gas, which was exhaled. By collecting breath samples and measuring radon content, Martland could quantify exactly how much radium remained in the women's bones. The results were horrifying. Grace Fryer, who had stopped working in 1924, still had enough radium in her body to produce detectable radiation 7 feet from her person. Her bones were essentially radioactive waste sites. Martland testified for 3 days. He explained the mechanism of death, how the alpha particles, unable to penetrate skin from outside, became lethal when released inside the bone marrow, how they destroyed the stem cells that produced blood, how they caused the bones to become brittle, filled with holes, until they shattered under their own weight. These women, he concluded, are walking dead. The radium will continue to decay for centuries. They will be radioactive in their graves. The trial lasted months. Grace Fryer, by this point unable to walk, testified from a wheelchair. She described the lip pointing, the encouragement from supervisors, the complete absence of warnings. She described her declining health, the teeth falling out, the bones breaking, the constant pain. She described the company's response, the dismissive doctors, the accusations of promiscuity, the desperate attempts to blame her for her own death. "I wanted to be a dancer," she said, her voice steady despite her physical decay. "I wanted to see Paris. I am 25 years old, and I am dying because I painted watch dials. All I want is for them to admit it. All I want is for this to never happen again." In the spring of 1928, the jury returned a verdict for the plaintiffs. But the award was insulting, $10,000 each, to be paid in annual installments, with the company reserving the right to terminate payments if the women died. Given that all 5 were terminal, this was essentially a promise to pay nothing. Barry appealed. The women appealed. And while they fought, they died. Catherine Schaub was first, in January 1929. Her spine had collapsed. She died of suffocation when her rib cage could no longer expand to draw breath. Edna Hussman followed in March, her body so riddled with holes that her bones were described as like lace. Albina Larice died in June, Quinta MacDonald in September. By 1930, only Grace Fryer remained. She died on October 27, 1933. She was 34 years old. To the end, she had fought, giving interviews, writing letters, trying to warn other workers. Her death certificate listed the cause as radium poisoning, a small victory, the first official acknowledgement of what had killed her. In her final interview, given to a reporter from the Newark Ledger, she said, "I have given my life for science, though I never knew it. Let them learn from me. Let them save the others." The Radium Girls did not die in vain. Their deaths, public, agonizing, well documented, created a scandal that could not be contained. In 1933, the U.S. Public Health Service launched a comprehensive study of radium dial painters, eventually examining over 2,000 workers. The results confirmed what the girls had claimed. The lip-pointing method was invariably fatal, with a latency period of 5 to 30 years. The dial painting industry did not end, it changed. Companies switched to safer methods, painting with brushes not pointed with lips, using masks and ventilation, monitoring workers for contamination. The lip dip paint technique was banned. The girls who came after, though there were fewer, as radium was gradually replaced by safer phosphorescent materials, did not glow. They did not die. This was the legacy. Not in the court judgments, which were inadequate, or the compensation, which was insulting, but in the lives saved. Millions of workers, in thousands of industries, protected by laws that traced their lineage to a stretcher in a Chicago courtroom, to a young woman with no jaw who refused to be called a whore, to 5 ghost girls who would not stop fighting even as their bones turned to dust. The Radium Dial Company building still stands on Clinton Street in Ottawa. It is empty now, a brick hulk with broken windows, surrounded by chain-link fence and warning signs. The soil around it is contaminated. The groundwater contains traces of radium that will persist for millennia. No one will ever live there again. But the girls are not forgotten. In 2011, a bronze statue was erected in Ottawa's City Park. A young woman holding a paintbrush, her face turned toward the sun. The plaque reads, "Dedicated to the women who suffered and died from radium poisoning, 1922 to 1935. Their sacrifice led to workplace safety laws that protect us still." Similar memorials exist in Orange, New Jersey, and in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, where a collective headstone marks the graves of the New Jersey Radium Girls. Their bones, even now, emit low levels of radiation. Geiger counters click faintly over their graves. They are still glowing, a century later, still warning. In 2020, a team of scientists exhumed the remains of several radium girls, seeking to understand the long-term effects of internal radiation exposure. They found that the radium had preserved certain tissues, the hair, the nails, while destroying others. It was, in its way, a final scientific contribution from women who had never sought to be martyrs, only to be heard. The watches they painted still exist, scattered in attics and antique shops. They still glow faintly, the radium paint decaying slowly toward darkness. If you find one, handle it carefully. Do not put it to your lips. Remember what it cost. And if you are an American worker, if you have ever expected a safe workplace, a warning label, a doctor's examination for occupational illness, remember Catherine Donohue. Remember Grace Fryer. Remember Charlotte Purcell, Inez Vallat, Quinta MacDonald, Albina Larice, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, and the dozens of others whose names were lost to time and corporate malice. They were factory girls. They were poor, they were young, they were female in an era that discounted all three. They had no votes, no money, no power. They were told they were lying, that they were promiscuous, that they were hysterical, that they were too late. They refused to believe it. They refused to be silenced. They fought until their last breaths, and in fighting, they changed the world. This is their story. This is the story of the Radium Girls. They glowed. They suffered. They died. And because they did, we live safer.